Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar, and I'm likely to get way out of my depth with today's guest in a big hurry, so it should be a fun listen. She's Chief Business Officer of a new company that's a bit of a departure for us. The company's not, at least not right now, developing a pipeline, but rather it's leveraging generative AI to do all sorts of useful things like reading and writing therapeutic proteins from scratch and making accessible to the biotech community an open sourced AI generated gene editor called OpenCRISPR. On today's show, Profluent's Dr. Hilary Eaton is with me. And while I'm not going to let her take me too far into the AI rabbit hole, we are going to learn a bit about how it works, and importantly, where and when it doesn't work, its applications in biotech, why Profluent is doing what it's doing, much of it for free, I might add, and what's inspired Hilary's life science career path, both personally and professionally. Hilary, welcome to the Business of Biotech.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm super excited that you're here to join us. I had the benefit of a conversation with you. For our listeners, just so you know, Hilary and I talked a couple of weeks ago, and I've been pumped to do this interview since we chatted because I was so excited and inspired by Hilary's enthusiasm. I'm setting the bar very high from the outset here, Hilary. You got to bring that in. You got to bring your A game. But I want to start out with your a little bit about where you came from and what got you into the space in the first place. So a little bit of background. Hilary earned her PhD in molecular cancer biology from Duke. She did her postdoc at Harvard. And then, Hilary, you got seemingly, like looking at it on paper, you got directly into licensing and business development deals. So that's where my curiosity gets piqued a little bit. What motivated this, what looked like a scientific or therapeutic sort of development-driven path? What motivated that switch early on into licensing and business development?
Yes, no, that's a good question. And I think, the story is that it's always more messy behind the scenes than it is on paper. I am a bit of a poster child for don't know what I want to be when I grow up, and maybe still don't know. When I think back, to the extent I remember it, to my decision to go to graduate school, it really comes back to science was in my family. So I grew up watching my dad. He was a career scientist, a chemist at Pfizer for his entire life. And he headed the team that developed Lipitor, their famous cholesterol lowering drug.
Yeah.
And I somehow got the, very mistaken idea that all scientists just work on drugs that millions of people take. And that sounded great to me, right? That sounded like a really direct path of helping people. And as a side note, I think now that I've become a parent myself, this really does make me think carefully about sharing both my successes, but also my failures with my kids so that they don't get sort of like a skewed view that everything in life works out. And in fact, when I had a follow-up conversation with my dad, I learned a lot about the many projects he worked on that were not Lipitor, that did not make it to the clinic. And it was a very enlightening conversation about, the ups and downs of a career that on paper can look like one very major success.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's really good perspective,
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
going through that with my kids right now. My daughter's about to go into college. My son's going into a second year of college, and they're, in that formative stage, and their perception, you don't really often think about what their perception of what you do and how you do it how that might influence them. Like you just looked at dad as like the Lipitor making hero, right?
Yes. Lipitor making, Lipitor taking. He takes his own medicine.
Yeah. There
And
you
so I
go.
kind of, it was sort of just a given that I was going to go to graduate school and sort of follow in his footsteps. I mean, he was always so inspiring to me. But then sort of like back to the career pivot. So, maybe halfway through my PhD and that sort of like you've gotten through the prelim, you're now working in a lab. And I started realizing that a lot of the basic science projects that are carried out in academic labs are never going to directly affect a patient's life. They're often very crucial steps to understanding the underlying mechanisms or pathways that are affected by disease. But they're many steps away from a medicine that's actually going to affect lives. And so during my postdoc at Harvard, I started to search for a more direct way to help people. And I'm a big fan of thinking about sort of inflection points
Mm.
and also pondering on how sometimes what can be a pivotal point for you, the other portion doesn't even realize that they said something that affected you. And I come back to there was a lunch and learn seminar with the then chief scientific officer of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. His name was Barrett Rollins. And he probably doesn't even remember this, but again, it made a huge impression on me at the time. And he was asked by somebody, how did he become CSO? Like, what was the transition from being a PI, being a lab head, over to a more administrative managerial role? And
Mhm.
in the course of his answer to that question, he mentioned what, was in principle a fairly simple exercise. It sounded like something that like a career counselor would give you to do back in high school. And he said, make a Venn diagram. And on the one side, have it be the things that you're good at versus the things that you're not, and be honest.
Mhm.
And then have the other side be a list of things you enjoy doing versus the types of things that you simply tolerate or maybe in fact hate. Um, and then he said, if you in your current role are not at that intersection between things you are good at and things you like doing, that does not mean that you are a failure at the thing you are trying to be. It means that your skill set and maybe your enthusiasm would probably be better fit for a different role.
Mhm.
Um, and that really struck me. And so I went home that night and made a Venn diagram. And first of all, it was a lot harder than I thought. Like getting honest with yourself about stuff that you aren't good at or that
Yeah.
you don't like doing, that can sometimes be a little depressing too, to see, kind of look at the current job you're doing and the list of things you don't enjoy is much bigger than the list of things you do enjoy.
Yeah.
Um, but it gave me a hint about what to look for next. And that was exploring the business side of science, being able to still leverage the skills I'd learned throughout graduate school and my postdoc, but sort of applying, some of my strengths in communication and in problem solving towards how could you make medicines and get them successfully to patients. And so I started sort of on, you could say, the light side of the dark side by dipping my toes into technology transfer at Dana-Farber. And that was really a crash course in many things that I had expected. I got to learn about agreement negotiation, intellectual property, budgeting, alliance management, all things that I had never touched on as part of my scientific training. But surprisingly, I also got a crash course in expanding my scientific horizons.
Mm.
Um, you work on these niche projects during your scientific training, and so much interesting science goes on beyond your project or your department at a research institute. And so I got, honestly, a broader picture, I think, of the science being done at Dana-Farber during my time in tech transfer than I had as a postdoc. With my head down working at the bench. And it was, I found myself every night back on PubMed, trying to learn about new areas of science that I hadn't been trained in. Like there was this new field called immuno-oncology. I knew
Mhm.
nothing about it, but I got assigned a portfolio for a couple of lab heads that worked in that space. Um, and it was absolutely fascinating to me to get to see kind of the best things, the most cutting edge things that were going on, and then to try and figure out which one of those things had legs to become a company or to be licensed to a pharma to become a medicine. And that was my introduction to business development.
That's wild. When you, after you had that exposure and a little bit of that experience, um, it, how did that reshuffle the Venn diagram? Deck's a bad analogy. How did reshuffle the Venn diagram? Like if you were to do that Venn diagram over again, did you find like, oh, the business side of things is kind of falling in a different place? Maybe the balance is a little bit different, or was it? I'm just curious about like how
Yeah.
that experience influenced.
I think, no job is ever perfect, but I found that the balance skewed a lot more towards that sweet spot of things that I hope that I'm good at and things that I really fundamentally enjoy doing. It's
Yeah.
whenever I give career advice to folks, in my network, it's that, indescribable feeling, or it's that like when I look at people, you can see when there's a sparkle in their eye. You can see when they're enjoying what they're doing in that moment. And you see times when that spark kind of dims and it's just the rote grind. And I don't know if there's ever going to be a job where your eyes are sparkling 100% of the time, because that might just be complete burnout or just, unrealistic. But I definitely noticed that there were a lot of things that brought that spark to my eye. This idea of, um, doing, for example, a deal negotiation. Ultimately, it's framed as you're on opposite sides of the table, right? And trying to get the best deal for your side of the table. But that's not really what it's all about. What you're trying to do is get at whatever science, whatever drug there is to be made there. And both of you want that. And each of you have some very real concerns about things that could go awry on the way to building that drug. And so figuring out sort of what the actual concerns are under the surface and then finding creative ways to compromise about those, that to me is fun.
Yeah.
It's a fun puzzle to work out.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think the Venn diagram would probably help a lot of people because like I've had conversations with people who have your academic background who would decidedly say that that is not fun, Hilary, not fun at all, So those exercises, I think it's good, like as your career goes on. And speaking of deal making, I think next stop in your career, you're doing big deals at Editas, right? Was that next after Dana-Farber?
Editas was next. Yeah.
Yeah. And during that time, you shared with me, and you said we could talk about this. It's personal, but you said we could talk about this. During that time, when you're doing these big deals for Editas, your career's starting to take off. You find out that you have, in fact, a personal connection to rare genetic disease, a very, very personal connection. So tell us a little bit about that story.
I'm happy to, actually. I think, honestly, if more people are able to be vulnerable and talk about their own experiences, it can sometimes help all of those folks out there who are living through similar things but feel so isolated because some of these things don't get talked about. So, as I was looking at the Editas role, in the background, my husband and I had been trying to have kids for some years without any success, and we ended up doing IVF. And so, ironically, I was actually waking up from having my eggs harvested when I got the call from Deb Palestrand at Editas saying that she was offering me the job. And I just had a nurse who said, okay, you've had general anesthesia, no big decisions, no driving. And then I got that call and I was like, yeah, I'm making this decision. And so, while I was at Editas, had two little IVF miracle babies, and was just so grateful that the career that I had embarked upon and science was able to sort of make a dream come true for us.
Yeah.
And then over the course, it's so busy, like two parents working full time in the biotech, two young babies, and it's just kind of like all a blur. But at some point along the way, we kind of experienced one of those like worst moments that you can have as a parent, where all of a sudden you realize that your kid is missing developmental milestones.
Mhm.
And like, when it's your first kid, you don't really have much to
Benchmark.
compare it to, right? You don't have benchmarks out there. And so it's kind of like, yeah, she's taken a while to sit up, but like, I don't know, there's a range. The pediatrician every time tells you, oh, kids are a range. It's a whole spectrum, right?
Yeah.
But it was more prominent in our second daughter. And at this point, actually, I think I had transitioned to Vor Bio. And I, she had some hearing loss at birth, but it's so hard with babies to figure out how profound certain things are. They don't exactly cooperate on the exam table with various tests. And so it wasn't until she was 9 or 10 months that we really realized how significant the hearing loss was. And there were a variety of other symptoms that kept popping up. But the biggest thing is, we were in it at one of the hearing sessions, and somebody says, oh, could she sit by herself in the chair without you holding her? And I said, oh, no, she can't sit up by herself. And they said, really? She's 10 months now. That's, she should be able to sit. And so
Yeah.
that led to being introduced to early intervention, which the state of Massachusetts does when you have a child with 2 or more developmental delays, and a whole host of additional specialists to look into why she was missing these gross motor and these fine motor milestones. And, what it came down to in the end is that she was so hypermobile, so flexible, that it was hard for her to build strength and figure out how to do some of these crucial things like sitting up or pulling to stand or crawling. And I can remember a point where I was in I think it was an orthopedic office. And Olivia at that point was, I think, maybe around 26 months
Hmm.
and not walking, so significantly delayed,
Hmm.
and just feeling extremely frustrated because we had gone through sort of a laundry list of different, pediatric specialties, and nobody was giving us answers. And I'm sitting in this office, and the doctor turns and looks at me and says, "Mom, are you bendy?" And I said, I mean, yes. What does this have to do with this conversation? She was like, "Do you have party tricks? Like, are you double jointed? Can you bend joints backwards?" And I said, "Yeah." And she was like, "I know what's going on here."
Yeah.
She's like, there's this thing, there's these host of connective tissue disorders where the most obvious symptom is this hypermobility. And she's like, and I think what we've got going on here is that this little girl, is just so bendy
Mhm.
without the corresponding strength, because how would she have built that up?
Right.
Right. I think that she needs, some braces. She needs some braces on her ankles, and just stabilizing some of those joints is going to really help with the immediate symptoms. Um, and it was just that moment of, could this really be it? Do we
Hmm.
have some light dawning? And so they fitted her with some custom orthotics. And we kind of thought, yeah, try sticking your 2-year-old in ankle braces. There's no way she'll take it. This is going to be a grand tantrum. And instead, we had that moment in the office where they put the ankle braces on her, and she turned and looked at me, and then she pulled up to stand. Like,
Wow.
"Mom, I was just waiting for this, you know?"
Yeah. A little support. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was walking within like 2 weeks after that. And so, you know, getting a diagnosis for a genetic disease is often a really long and discouraging process, because there are so many of them, and some of
Hmm.
them come with such, amorphous constellation of symptoms. And so I think, we got phenomenally lucky to be in Boston and to have some amazing physicians in our network that were able to get us there, but one of the issues here is that there aren't, just as there aren't treatments, there are also not diagnostics for many of these things. So
Yeah.
the this particular disorder is called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or HEDS for short. And for this particular subvariant of disease, there are no known genetic variants. So it's not, you can't just send a blood sample in and have a doctor say, yes, you have the mutation, or no, you don't. Instead, they're looking down sort of, a bucket list of clinical symptoms. And if you meet enough of the criteria, then you're deemed to have the disease. And the thing is, my girls at the time, 2 and 4, they were too young to have had some of the life experiences that would have led to some of the symptoms, like repeated dislocations,
Hmm.
slow wound healing. And so the doctors came to me and said, "Mom, an alternative approach here would be if you got officially diagnosed, that would allow us to then diagnose your children." And so I found myself in a doctor's office at, I don't know, 37 or something, being asked all these questions. And all of a sudden, so many different symptoms or weird medical things that had happened to me over the course of 37 years were drawn together
Yeah.
into a diagnosis. And I still can remember, the doctor at the near the end, the geneticist at the end of the appointment said, "Heartwarming that you're doing this, in order to get your kids, diagnosed and on the path, to ameliorating their symptoms." He was like, "Also, you've just been living with this for several decades. You're kind of screwed up health wise, and you need doctors.
Yeah.
You need to go see specialists for some of these different conditions." And I just thought it was too funny, that progression sort of like to diagnosis,
Yeah.
that like symptoms that I had experienced somehow weren't worth it to me, or didn't rise above the radar to maybe I should go see a doctor about this. But when it was my kids, the mama bear comes out and you're like, okay, let's get this solved, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the path to getting diagnosed.
You didn't call your mom and say, "Hey, thanks, mom, for not noticing that it took me 36 months to sit up in my high chair."
Well, the funny thing was, I had normal progression with motor development. What they're finding with a lot of these disorders is that you see something that's called anticipation with generation. So maybe grandma has it, mom
Hmm.
has it a little worse, kid has it a little bit worse. And so it actually made a lot of sense. It's actually led to our whole extended family being tested, because, there's the part of this journey that's getting an answer for yourself. there's also a part of this journey that's how can you help the broader community? So when somebody shows up in a clinic and there's no family history of any of these symptoms, it's very hard then to look for what in their DNA might be causing these symptoms.
Sure.
When you have a large extended family with folks who are quote unquote normal and folks who are less normal, you can start finding patterns where you can say, okay, maybe we have 75,000 SNPs or random mutations in our genome, but there's only this one SNP that's in the affected females in this family. So we saw it as both answers for ourselves, but just as science, my husband and I are both scientists. My dad's a scientist. We had this, immense curiosity about what is causing this and can we add to the knowledge in the field?
Were you already thinking about the impact of data sets in science and in life sciences and therapeutic development when you experienced this, or did it sort of inform your perspective on data sets? Boy, data sets are really important to therapeutic development.
It's a little bit of both. So, I mean, during my time at Dana-Farber, one of the things that came up is that, they treat so many patients every year. And there's data from treatment outcomes, there's data on symptoms, there's also data in the form of actual patient samples, like biospecimens. And you learn a lot from seeing how somebody's tissue changes over the course of disease progression and then treatment. And so one of the things that we worked on at Dana-Farber is making sure that when you're writing up IRB consents, IRB protocols to enroll patients in clinical trials, that you can really explain to them how valuable their data is and how it might be used in the development of new medicines and what precautions you take to keep the right privacy around that data. And then to find myself sitting on the patient side of that seat, reading patient consents that I might have had a hand in writing, it hits hard. And there can be that instinct of like, no, my genes are mine. My information is my own private. And I respect people very much who make that decision. I think maybe, somewhat uniquely because of the science background, part of me said, yeah, I'll put it all on the table. If somebody can learn something from my cells, my DNA, that means there's a mom down the line whose baby is diagnosed at birth and who learns some of these, developmental things on a regular schedule, I will have contributed in a meaningful way that has, nothing to do with like a personal achievement at all. It's just something that's like inherent in my body.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Before I ask you the next question, how are your girls doing today? How are they doing now?
They are doing phenomenally. So, one of the things that we've really tried to do is treat the medical world. It takes a village, let's put it that way. And we've assembled together a team of specialists that track throughout. How do I put this? You have connective tissue in literally every place in your body. So there are a whole range of things that can go wrong with this disease. And it used to be that they would only pick up patients fairly late in life. I think the last quote that I heard from the patient community is that the average time to diagnosis for Ehlers-Danlos is 14 years. So you're often dealing with folks in sort of young to mid-adulthood. Now Boston Children's Hospital is seeing a lot of much younger kids coming in.
Yeah.
And they don't really know what disease progression is going to look like. They don't know how early certain symptoms are going to pop up. And so, we just made sure that we got, the right team in place with regular check-in schedules. And it's, thing will solve problems. It can be a little bit like whack-a-mole because, you think you've gotten to a good state and then something new pops up. But I think I'm just so incredibly lucky that I have this network of friends and colleagues and former colleagues that I can draw on when some of these new things pop up to figure out, how to frame the approach. It's, something happens, so figure out how to solve it, figure out who the people are to talk to. And they're doing wonderfully. They're both in school now. They're just really thriving. And in some ways, as much as I was, sad to find out that I have a disease that I had passed on to them, my therapist, my executive coach, all my friends, the point to drive home is that who better to parent a child with rare disease than a mom who already knows what it's like to live. Like, there's nobody better to advocate for them in some.
Yeah. And to demonstrate the strength that's possible in spite of the disease, right?
100%, 100%, because that is one aspect of my persona, that I have a rare disease. That does not define me.
Mm-hmm.
Does it limit me? Perhaps in certain ways, but it's interesting to figure out how you can sort of like find hacks or band-aids or approaches that allow you uh, to ambitiously go after your career goals while still dealing with some of these things that are happening in the background. Sometimes I almost think that maybe that in and of itself is what led to me having certain strengths in my career in business development, because I'm not afraid to go out there and advocate for things and ask the hard questions and try to come up with creative solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I hope you're still buying an annual bottle of wine for that pediatrician who asked you if you're bendy, because thank God for her. That's fantastic.
Absolutely.